Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we travel far beyond the pyramids of Egypt, beyond the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, to a time when the very first teachers of civilization may not have been human at all. Thousands of years ago, the oldest records on Earth began whispering the same strange story. Clay tablets buried beneath the ruins of ancient Sumer speak of mysterious beings who arrived before the rise of kings. Egyptian temple walls remember a sacred age called the First Time. The Book of Enoch describes watchers descending from the sky to share knowledge humanity was never meant to possess. And across ancient civilizations scattered around the world, the same pattern quietly appears again and again. Non-human teachers arrive. They bring advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and the secrets of the stars. Humanity learns, civilization rises, and then something happens. A catastrophe, a flood, a sudden silence where those teachers once stood. Tonight, in this long and gentle journey through history for sleep, we will follow the traces they left behind. We will explore the ancient city of Eridu, the astronomical records hidden on 7,000-year-old pottery, the forbidden pages of the Book of Enoch, the strange numbers of the Sumerian king list, and the flood stories that echo across nearly every ancient civilization on Earth. Were these stories simply myths created by ancient people trying to explain the unknown? Or are they fragments of a memory far older than any written history? A memory of beings sometimes called the Watchers, sometimes the Anunnaki, who may have shaped the earliest chapters of human civilization. Tonight's episode is not about proving one answer or another. Instead, it is about exploring the quiet echoes left behind in ancient history, the patterns that appear again and again across temples, tablets, and sacred texts. And as the night grows deeper and the world becomes still, we will listen to those echoes together, slowly, gently, one piece at a time, like a calm stream of bedtime history guiding you toward rest. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, relax your shoulders, let the day slowly fade away, and allow your mind to drift back thousands of years to the ancient world where the first whispers of the Watchers began. Long before the first pharaoh ever stood beneath the burning Egyptian sun, long before the first cuneiform stylus pressed gently into wet clay along the rivers of Mesopotamia, there were already stories drifting through the quiet memory of the earth. Stories that spoke not of kings or temples, but of something stranger, something older, something that seemed to exist before what we normally call the beginning of ancient history. Tonight, as the day slowly loosens its grip on your thoughts and the rhythm of sleep begins to settle around you, imagine the soft whisper of desert winds moving across endless dunes. Beneath those dunes lie cities that once breathed with life. Beneath those cities lie older cities still, and beneath those are memories buried so deeply that even the oldest civilizations believed they were already ancient when they first discovered them. This is where our journey truly begins. Not in Egypt, not in Babylon, but in a quiet place at the southern edge of Mesopotamia where fresh water once flowed gently into the Persian Gulf. The place was called Eridu. To modern archaeologists, Eridu is often described as one of the first cities in human history. But the deeper researchers dug into the earth there, the more unsettling the story became. In 1946, excavations began carefully removing the layers of soil that had accumulated over thousands of years. Each layer represented a chapter of time. Normally, in ancient civilizations, archaeologists expect a predictable pattern. The deepest layers should contain the simplest structures: rough huts, uneven walls, evidence of early experimentation as humans slowly learn how to build. But Eridu did not follow that pattern. Instead, something very strange happened. The deeper the archaeologists dug, the more advanced the structures became. What should have been the earliest phase of settlement revealed surprisingly sophisticated architecture. Carefully aligned foundations, drainage systems designed to control seasonal floods, ventilation channels that suggested an understanding of airflow inside enclosed spaces. These were not crude experiments, they were confident designs. It was as if the people who first built Eridu already knew exactly what they were doing. No gradual improvement, no awkward beginning. The city appeared almost fully formed, as though a blueprint had existed before the first brick was ever placed. For scholars studying ancient civilizations, this created a quiet puzzle that never quite found a comfortable explanation. Because according to the conventional model of history, knowledge evolves slowly. People experiment, they fail, they learn. Over generations, small improvements accumulate. But Eridu seemed to skip that entire process. And that is when some historians turned their attention to the ancient texts themselves. The Sumerians left behind thousands of clay tablets inscribed with the earliest form of writing we know, cuneiform. Many of these texts describe kings, trade, and daily life, but hidden among them are stranger records, stories that the scribes themselves treated with careful seriousness, stories describing the origins of knowledge itself. According to those ancient tablets, the earliest wisdom of civilization did not arise gradually from human discovery. Instead, it was delivered, given, shared by beings the Sumerians referred to with a quiet reverence. They called them the Watchers. Not rulers in the way later kings would rule, not gods demanding worship or sacrifice, but observers, teachers, instructors who appeared when humanity was still standing at the edge of its own beginning. As your breathing grows slower and your body sinks deeper into the comfort of rest, imagine what that early world might have felt like. No cities yet stretching across continents, no empires clashing across the horizon, only small communities gathered beside rivers, watching the sky, wondering how the patterns of nature worked. And then, according to those ancient Sumerian records, something remarkable happened. Knowledge arrived. Writing, mathematics, the measurement of land, the reading of stars, the shaping of metals from stone and fire, entire systems of civilization appearing not slowly, but almost suddenly. The Sumerians did not describe this as a miracle, they described it as instruction, as if someone had patiently shown humanity the foundations of culture, then stepped quietly back into the silence of history. And so, the mystery of Eridu becomes more than an archaeological anomaly. It becomes the opening whisper of a much older story, a story that ancient texts suggest began long before the earliest kings of Egypt, long before the pyramids rose from the desert, long before the earliest dynasties carved their names into stone. A story about watchers who observed the dawn of humanity and perhaps guided it. For now, let that thought rest gently in your mind like a distant echo from forgotten centuries. Because the deeper we travel into these buried memories of ancient history, the more we begin to see that the foundations of civilization may hold secrets far older than we once imagined. and the quiet sands of Eridu may be where the first trace of those forgotten teachers still waits. Now allow the quiet of the room around you to deepen a little further. The world outside your window continues to move, of course, but here, in this moment, there is only the slow rhythm of your breathing and the gentle unfolding of a story older than any empire. In the Sumerian tablets, the beings who appeared at the beginning of civilization were not described with dramatic thunder or divine spectacle. They were described with something far stranger, calm precision. The scribes referred to them with a word that can be translated loosely as those who watch. In their language, the term suggested patient observation rather than domination. They were not conquerors, they were not kings, they were watchers. And that single detail has quietly fascinated historians for generations, because the earliest records do not portray them as rulers demanding obedience. Instead, they appear almost like instructors stepping into a classroom that had only just begun to form. Imagine, if you will, a shoreline at the edge of the ancient Persian Gulf nearly 7,000 years ago. The tides move slowly beneath a pale dawn. Early human settlements cluster near the water, where fishing and fresh river channels provide the simplest means of survival. The people living there would have understood seasons, storms, and the movement of animals. But writing, mathematics, the mapping of the heavens, those ideas would have been unimaginable. And yet the Sumerian texts insist that these skills appeared suddenly, as if someone had carefully opened a door to knowledge that had always existed, but had never been shared before. One of the most intriguing accounts comes from a Babylonian priest named Berosus, who lived during the 3rd century BCE. Berosus was not inventing myths for entertainment. He was compiling histories based on much older temple archives preserved in Babylonian and Sumerian tradition. In those records, he described a being known as Oannes. The description is unusual, even by the standards of ancient storytelling. Oannes, Berosus wrote, emerged each morning from the waters of the Persian Gulf. His form was said to resemble a fish, yet beneath that outer shape was the voice and mind of a human teacher. During the daylight hours, he walked among the earliest communities and taught them the foundations of civilization. He explained how to shape clay into writing tablets. He demonstrated how numbers could measure the movement of time and stars. He showed farmers how the cycles of the moon influenced planting and harvest. He introduced laws, architecture, and systems of governance that could hold a society together. And when the sun sank below the horizon, Oannes returned quietly to the sea. He asked for nothing. He accepted no tribute. He ate no food among humans. According to the record, he existed only to teach. At first glance, this might sound like one of the many symbolic stories found in ancient mythologies. But what makes the account of Oannes so curious is the tone in which it was preserved. The ancient scribes did not present it as a legend meant to entertain children. They recorded it as part of their historical understanding of how civilization began. In fact, Berosus wrote that Oannes was only the first among several such instructors who appeared over time. Each one brought additional knowledge. Each one expanded the capabilities of early human societies. The records refer to them collectively as the Abgau, sometimes translated as the great sages of the waters. The idea of knowledge emerging from the sea may seem poetic to modern listeners, but for the ancient world, the symbolism had practical roots. Rivers and oceans were the lifelines of early civilization. Every great culture rose beside water. The sea was not only a boundary of mystery, it was also a source of life, trade, and transformation. To say that wisdom came from the water was, in many ways, to say that civilization itself flowed from a deeper source than humanity alone. As your thoughts begin to soften and drift toward the quiet edge of sleep, imagine those early mornings along the shores of ancient Mesopotamia.
a figure emerging slowly from the shimmering horizon of the sea, a teacher who spoke not in riddles but in instructions, teaching people how to measure the land beneath their feet and the stars above their heads, teaching them how to build cities where none had existed before, teaching them, perhaps, how to become something more than they had ever been. Whether Oannes was a literal figure, a symbolic memory, or something else entirely remains one of the great questions of forbidden history and ancient civilizations. Yet the story appears again and again across different records separated by centuries, and the message remains remarkably consistent. The earliest wisdom of civilization did not begin with human discovery alone. It began with teachers, with watchers, and with knowledge that seemed to arrive suddenly at the dawn of recorded ancient history. And as the quiet rhythm of bedtime history continues to carry you gently through these ancient memories, we begin to approach another layer of the mystery. Because the texts do not describe only one teacher emerging from the waters, they describe 7.
And now, as the quiet weight of night settles more gently around you, allow your mind to drift just a little deeper into the slow current of this ancient story. Because the records preserved by the Sumerian scribes do not end with a single teacher rising from the sea. Instead, they describe a small circle of instructors whose presence shaped the earliest foundations of civilization. 7 in total. 7 figures remembered across different tablets, different centuries, and different cities of the ancient world. The Sumerians called them the Abgal, a word that can be translated as the great sages of the deep waters. The phrase itself carries a certain calm authority, as if these beings were not distant gods ruling from the sky, but wise instructors emerging quietly from the hidden places of the earth. According to the ancient tablets, each Abgal guided humanity in a different domain of knowledge. And what makes these records so intriguing is not merely the existence of these 7 teachers, but the specificity of the knowledge attributed to each one. These were not vague symbols of wisdom. The texts describe particular fields of understanding, the very same foundations upon which the earliest ancient civilizations would later build their societies. One of the most frequently mentioned among them was Adapa, often remembered as the wisest of the Abgal. The ancient texts describe Adapa as a figure whose understanding of natural forces was so profound that he could influence the movement of winds themselves. In one remarkable account preserved on a clay tablet, Adapa is said to have spoken words of such power that the south wind was broken for 7 days. To modern ears, this might sound like a poetic exaggeration, but if we listen carefully to the language of the past, we may notice something else hiding within the story. Ancient people did not have the vocabulary of modern physics. They could not speak of atmospheric pressure or resonance frequencies. Yet many of their descriptions hint at the idea that sound, vibration, and spoken words could influence the physical world around them. Today, scientists studying acoustic resonance know that certain frequencies can indeed affect matter. Sound can move sand into intricate geometric patterns. It can shatter glass. It can alter the behavior of fluids. When the Sumerians wrote that Adapa spoke words capable of influencing the wind, they may have been describing something far more subtle than a simple myth. The second of the great instructors was Uwana, often associated with the earliest understanding of mathematics and astronomy. The tablets suggest that Uwana taught early humans how to observe the sky, not simply as a field of lights, but as a system of repeating patterns. The rising and setting of stars could mark the passage of seasons. The movement of planets could help predict floods along the great rivers. With this knowledge came the first calendars, the first attempts to measure time, and the earliest foundations of what we now call scientific observation. Another of the Abgal, known as Enmeduga, was remembered for teaching the cycles of agriculture.
Before this knowledge, early communities may have depended largely on gathering wild plants or following migrating animals. But once the rhythms of soil, water, and sunlight were understood, entire societies could settle permanently in one place. Fields could be planted, harvests could be stored, cities could grow, and with stable food supplies came the possibility of culture, art, writing, and law. En-Megalama was said to have instructed humans in the secrets of metalworking. In a world where stone tools had once dominated daily life, the discovery that certain rocks could melt and reshape under intense heat must have seemed almost magical. Yet through this knowledge came stronger tools, more durable weapons, and the technological momentum that would eventually shape the Bronze Age. En-Mebeluga, another of the sages, taught the measurement of land and the prediction of floods. This knowledge was essential in a landscape dominated by rivers that could nourish or destroy entire communities depending on their seasonal cycles. To understand the rise and fall of water levels meant survival. It meant planning. It meant transforming the unpredictable forces of nature into something that could be studied and anticipated. Another teacher, remembered in some texts as Enlilda, was associated with governance and record-keeping. It was through this knowledge that the earliest systems of law, administration, and social organization began to take shape. Writing itself became more than simple marks on clay. It became the memory of civilization, the means by which knowledge could survive across generations. And finally, there was the last of the 7 instructors, a figure named Utu-Abzu. The texts describe him with a tone that feels almost wistful, as if the scribes themselves sensed that his departure marked the end of something important. According to the records, Utu-Abzu eventually ascended to the heavens and did not return. After his departure, the appearances of the Abgal ceased. The teachers who had guided humanity through its earliest steps into civilization simply disappeared from the historical record. And this is perhaps the most curious detail of all. The texts never describe a war between humans and these instructors. They never speak of rebellion or punishment. Instead, the story ends quietly, as though a task had been completed, as though a program of instruction had reached its final lesson. 7 teachers, 7 domains of knowledge, 7 early cities where the seeds of ancient civilizations would take root. And then, silence. As the ancient history of humanity continued to unfold, those mysterious instructors faded into legend. Yet their memory remained preserved in clay tablets buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia. Tablets that waited thousands of years to be rediscovered by archaeologists and historians. And so, as you feel the gentle pull of sleep beginning to soften the edges of your thoughts, remember that the earliest chapters of human civilization may contain far more than simple stories. They may hold echoes of a time when knowledge arrived like a quiet gift from watchers who observed the dawn of our world. And in the next part of our journey through bedtime history and the mysteries of forbidden history, we will travel even further back, beyond the earliest cities, beyond the first kings, to a time when the watchers themselves may have first appeared upon the earth.
What if the oldest written records on Earth were never meant to mark the beginning of knowledge, but instead the moment when something older was beginning to fade? What if the tiny wedge-shaped impressions we call cuneiform were not the invention of writing, but the final attempt to preserve memories that human voices had once carried effortlessly across centuries? As you settle deeper into the quiet rhythm of this bedtime history, imagine once again the world of ancient Mesopotamia slowly emerging from the soft darkness of time. The rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates move quietly through the plains, feeding fields of barley and reeds. Small communities gather near temple walls and mud brick houses. And somewhere within the growing city of Uruk, around the year 3400 BCE, a scribe sits cross-legged on a cool stone floor. In one hand, he holds a small piece of damp clay, still soft from the riverbank. In the other hand, he holds a stylus carved from a reed. With calm concentration, he presses the tip into the clay, leaving behind a tiny wedge-shaped mark. Another mark follows, then another. Slowly, a pattern begins to form. To us today, this moment appears simple, almost humble. Yet historians studying ancient civilizations recognize it as one of the most extraordinary turning points in human history. Because this is writing, or at least the earliest written system that archaeology has ever discovered. But here is where the mystery begins. When scholars first began studying the earliest cuneiform tablets from Uruk, they expected to find a primitive system just beginning to evolve. A few crude symbols, perhaps, rough drawings slowly transforming into more complex signs. That is how writing normally develops in human cultures. It begins with simple pictographs and gradually grows more elaborate as societies become more sophisticated. Yet the earliest tablets from Uruk refuse to follow this pattern. Instead of simplicity, they reveal complexity from the very beginning. The collection, known as the Uruk IV corpus, contains more than 700 distinct signs already in use. 700 symbols, each representing different objects, numbers, actions, or ideas. This is not the hesitant experimentation of a newly invented language. It is a fully structured system of information management, a system capable of tracking grain deliveries, temple offerings, livestock populations, trade transactions, and labor distribution across an entire city. In other words, when writing first appears in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia, it does not arrive as a newborn invention, it arrives as a mature tool. It is as though someone had switched on a lamp in a room that had been dark for thousands of years. One moment there is no writing at all. The next moment there is an organized administrative language with hundreds of standardized symbols. For historians of ancient history, this creates an uncomfortable puzzle. Because there is no archaeological evidence showing how those hundreds of symbols slowly developed. No intermediate stages carved on cave walls, no early prototypes scratched into pottery or bone, no gradual sequence that shows writing evolving step by step. The tablets appear suddenly, fully operational. One particular tablet discovered in the temple district of Uruk has quietly fascinated researchers for decades. Cataloged under the identifier W-20030.7, this small clay record contains mathematical calculations of remarkable precision. These calculations deal with the measurement of agricultural fields and the distribution of resources among temple workers. The numbers are not rough approximations, they are exact values derived from a consistent mathematical framework. Modern mathematicians who have examined the tablet have confirmed that the calculations are accurate and logically structured. Yet the tablet dates to the very dawn of written ancient history, which raises a haunting question that scholars still debate today. How could the very first written documents already contain advanced mathematical thinking? It is almost as if the people of Uruk had been performing these calculations for generations before they ever attempted to record them in clay. Imagine the scene once more as your breathing grows slower and the gentle cadence of bedtime stories begins to settle over your thoughts. The scribe in Uruk presses another symbol into the clay. Each small wedge mark represents knowledge that may have lived long before writing itself existed. The clay tablet does not create the knowledge, it simply captures it, preserves it, freezes a moment of memory before it disappears into time. And if that is true, then writing may not represent the birth of knowledge at all. It may represent something far more fragile, the moment when humanity realized that memory alone might no longer be enough to carry ancient civilizations forward. And so the scribe presses his stylus into clay once more, quietly beginning a tradition that will preserve ancient history for thousands of years. Yet even as he works, the deeper mystery remains. If writing appeared so suddenly in Mesopotamia, then the knowledge behind it must have existed somewhere else first. Somewhere older, somewhere spoken, somewhere remembered. Now, let your breathing grow softer again, and allow the quiet of this moment to guide your thoughts gently away from the waking world. Because if writing appeared suddenly in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, then the knowledge written into those clay tablets must have existed long before the first stylus ever touched wet clay. This realization leads historians of ancient civilizations to a deeply intriguing possibility. Perhaps the earliest knowledge of humanity was never meant to be written at all. Perhaps it lived first in something far more fragile, yet far more powerful: human memory. In the world before writing, memory was not a casual skill. It was a discipline, a craft practiced with astonishing precision by those entrusted to carry the stories, laws, rituals, and knowledge of an entire society. Imagine again the temples of ancient Mesopotamia in the centuries before cuneiform. The air inside the temple halls is cool and still, scented faintly with oil lamps and river clay. Within those quiet chambers, young initiates sit in circles around a teacher whose voice moves slowly through the darkness. They are not reading, they are listening. Each phrase spoken aloud must be repeated, preserved, and remembered exactly as it was delivered. Because in a world without writing, knowledge survives only if human voices can carry it forward. To modern minds, this may sound impossible, yet history provides remarkable evidence that such memory traditions were not only possible, but extraordinarily accurate. Consider the Vedic traditions of ancient India, where sacred texts containing thousands of verses were transmitted orally for more than 3,000 years before they were ever written down. Scholars who have compared different oral lineages discovered something astonishing. Across thousands of lines of complex phonetic recitation, the variation between versions was less than 1%. In other words, human memory, when trained through ritual repetition and discipline, can preserve information with extraordinary precision across generations. The Sumerian world appears to have practiced something similar. Hidden within the ancient tablets are references to a set of sacred oral formulas known as the Nam.Ku. These were not simply stories or myths, they were spoken sequences of knowledge considered more authoritative than any written tablet. A clay tablet could crack, break, or be miscopied by a careless scribe. But the Nam.Ku lived in the trained memory of those who had spent years mastering their precise pronunciation and rhythm. Each syllable was preserved exactly. Each breath between words carried meaning. When recited correctly, these spoken formulas were believed to carry the original wisdom that shaped the earliest ancient civilizations. And here, the mystery deepens even further. According to the Sumerian tradition, the Nam.Ku were not human compositions. The texts themselves suggest that these sacred recitations were the original teachings delivered by the Watchers. Words spoken long before writing existed, remembered faithfully through generations of trained voices. Imagine the extraordinary chain of memory required to preserve such knowledge. A teacher speaking to a student, the student repeating the words again and again until every syllable becomes second nature. That student later becoming a teacher to another generation. The same words moving through time, carried not by ink or clay, but by breath and sound. 50 generations could pass, yet the words would remain unchanged. This idea may feel almost mythical to modern listeners accustomed to written records and digital archives. Yet in the ancient world, oral transmission was not merely a fallback for illiterate societies. It was often considered the most reliable way to preserve sacred knowledge. Writing could distort meaning. Memory, when trained through ritual, could preserve it.
And if the Sumerians were correct, then the earliest knowledge of ancient history may have lived first in human voices, long before it was ever pressed into clay tablets. The scribes of Uruk were not inventing knowledge, they were capturing something that had already existed for centuries, perhaps even longer. As your mind continues to drift deeper towards sleep, imagine those ancient recitations echoing softly through temple halls thousands of years ago, voices repeating words that had been spoken long before writing began. Words said to have originated from teachers who watched the earliest dawn of human civilization. And slowly, generation by generation, those spoken memories would eventually reach the moment when someone finally decided to press them into clay. Yet even then, not everything could be captured. Some knowledge remained too complex, too sacred, or too fragile to entrust entirely to writing. And so the tablets preserved only fragments, echoes of a much older system of knowledge that may once have existed in human memory alone. But occasionally, among the thousands of surviving clay tablets of Mesopotamia, we discover something even stranger. A mathematical record so precise that it seems to belong to a much later age. A tablet whose numbers whisper of knowledge far beyond what historians once believed ancient civilizations possessed. And that tablet still exists today, resting quietly in a modern library thousands of miles away from the rivers where it was first created.
Now let the quiet of the night settle even deeper around you, and allow your thoughts to move slowly through the dim corridors of ancient history. Because among the many clay tablets discovered across Mesopotamia, there exists one small artifact that has quietly unsettled historians and mathematicians alike for more than a century. It is not large. In fact, it could easily fit into the palm of your hand. Its surface is worn by time, the edges softened by thousands of years of buried silence beneath the soil of ancient civilizations. Yet on its surface are numbers, carefully arranged numbers, numbers that whisper of knowledge that should not exist where they are found. This tablet is known today as Plimpton 322. It rests now in the rare book and manuscript library at Columbia University in New York, far from the rivers and temples where it was first created nearly 4,000 years ago. At first glance, the tablet appears simple. 15 rows of numbers arranged in 4 columns. No diagrams, no explanation, just sequences of carefully organized values pressed into clay by a Babylonian scribe sometime around 1800 BCE. For decades after its discovery, scholars struggled to understand exactly what those numbers represented. They were clearly mathematical, but they did not resemble simple accounting records or grain inventories like many other tablets from Mesopotamia. Instead, the pattern of the numbers hinted at something far more sophisticated. Slowly, mathematicians began to recognize what they were looking at. The numbers on Plimpton 322 correspond to sets of values known today as Pythagorean triples, pairs of numbers that describe the relationship between the sides of a right triangle. In modern mathematics, this relationship is usually introduced through the Pythagorean theorem, a principle traditionally attributed to the Greek philosopher Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE. Yet Plimpton 322 predates Pythagoras by more than 1,000 years, which means the knowledge contained within the tablet cannot possibly have originated from Greek mathematics. Instead, it suggests that Babylonian scholars were already working with sophisticated geometric relationships long before classical Greek science emerged. But the mystery deepens further. Recent research conducted by Dr. Daniel Mansfield and his colleagues at the University of New South Wales has revealed something even more surprising about this ancient artifact. When the numbers on Plimpton 322 are examined carefully, they appear to form a trigonometric table, a list of numerical relationships that allow precise calculations of triangle angles and side lengths. In modern mathematics, trigonometry is considered an advanced branch of geometry, essential for astronomy, engineering, and navigation. Yet, according to conventional historical timelines, systematic trigonometry was not formally developed until the work of the Greek astronomer Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE. That would make Plimpton 322 more than 1,000 years older than the supposed birth of trigonometry. Even more intriguing is the numerical system used by the Babylonians themselves. Unlike our modern base 10 system, the mathematicians of ancient Mesopotamia used a base 60 number system. At first, this may seem inconvenient, yet base 60 possesses remarkable mathematical advantages. Many fractions that produce long repeating decimals in base 10 can be expressed cleanly and precisely in base 60. When Mansfield's team analyzed the structure of Plimpton 322, they found that the tablet may actually represent a trigonometric method that is in some ways more efficient than modern approaches for certain calculations. In other words, a clay tablet created nearly 4,000 years ago may preserve mathematical insights that rival or even surpass later techniques developed thousands of years afterward. For historians of ancient civilizations, this discovery raises a question that feels both exciting and unsettling. Where did this knowledge originate? The Babylonians themselves did not claim to invent it. Their mathematical traditions were inherited from earlier Sumerian culture. And according to the ancient Sumerian texts, the earliest foundations of knowledge were taught by the Abgal, the instructors who emerged from the waters at the dawn of civilization, the Watchers. Perhaps the scribes who created Plimpton 322 did not see themselves as inventors at all. Perhaps they believed they were simply preserving fragments of a much older intellectual tradition, a tradition passed down through oral memory, temple instruction, and eventually the quiet permanence of clay. As your thoughts begin to soften once more, imagine the Babylonian scribe who pressed those numbers into clay nearly 4,000 years ago. He may not have known that his small record would one day sit in a distant library studied by mathematicians of a future civilization he could never imagine. Yet the numbers he left behind still carry meaning. They remind us that ancient history is not always as simple as the timelines we draw in textbooks. Beneath the surface of early writing may lie traces of knowledge that once flowed through human memory long before it found its way onto clay. And so, as your mind drifts gently towards sleep, allow the quiet mystery of those ancient numbers to dissolve into the darkness behind your eyelids. Because somewhere in the long unfolding story of ancient civilizations, there may have been a moment when knowledge arrived, long before humanity knew how to write it down. 5,000 years ago, on the vast and seemingly empty plains of southern Mesopotamia, long before telescopes, satellites, or modern astronomy ever existed, people living along the slow rivers of what we now call Iraq appear to have mapped the night sky with a precision that still puzzles researchers today. The land itself offered little help to observers. The horizon was flat and unbroken for miles in every direction, a landscape of reeds, mud brick settlements, and shimmering heat rising from the earth. And yet, when the sun disappeared beyond that distant horizon each evening, the sky above Mesopotamia revealed something extraordinary. The stars emerged in a slow and predictable rhythm, night after night, season after season, year after year. Ancient people everywhere looked up at those stars with curiosity, but what archaeologists discovered in the late 20th century suggested that some of the earliest inhabitants of Mesopotamia may have been doing far more than simply admiring the sky. At an archaeological site called Tel Es-Sawan, located north of modern Baghdad, excavations during the 1960s uncovered a collection of pottery fragments buried beneath the soil of an ancient settlement that had existed nearly 7,000 years ago. At first glance, the pottery seemed unremarkable. Small bowls, jars, and vessels decorated with patterns of dots, lines, and curved shapes painted carefully along their surfaces. For decades, these fragments were cataloged as simple decorative objects. Archaeologists assumed that the patterns were merely artistic expressions, the kind of visual designs commonly found in many early cultures. After all, people living in ancient civilizations often decorated everyday objects with repeating motifs simply because they were pleasing to the eye. But something about these patterns continued to draw quiet curiosity from a handful of researchers who specialized in archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient civilizations observed and recorded the sky. In the 1990s, a team of scholars decided to examine the pottery fragments again, this time comparing the positions of the painted dots with known star configurations. What they discovered was unexpected. The dots were not randomly arranged, they formed patterns that corresponded closely with recognizable constellations, not as those constellations appear today, but as they would have appeared thousands of years earlier when the pottery was first created. Slowly, the realization began to settle among the researchers studying the fragments. The pottery was not decorated with abstract art. It appeared to contain encoded maps of the night sky. Lines connecting the dots corresponded to known stellar alignments, while curved patterns seemed to follow the phases of the moon across a monthly cycle. Even more intriguing was the subtle shift in star positions represented on different vessels, a shift that matched the slow astronomical movement known today as axial precession. This phenomenon occurs because the Earth itself wobbles gently on its axis, like a spinning top that gradually changes direction. Over thousands of years, this wobble causes the apparent positions of stars to drift slowly across the sky. Modern astronomers understand this process through advanced instruments and precise measurements, but recognizing it requires careful observation sustained across many generations. And yet, the pottery of Tel Es Sawan appears to encode exactly this kind of long-term astronomical awareness. The people who painted those vessels were not merely decorating household objects, they were recording the sky. That realization raises an intriguing question for historians of ancient civilizations. The settlement at Tel Es Sawan existed for only a limited period of time, perhaps a few centuries at most. Yet the astronomical patterns embedded in the pottery suggest observational records extending far longer. To detect the gradual drift of star positions requires consistent observation over hundreds of years, possibly even longer. This means that whoever created these early star charts must have inherited a body of sky knowledge already accumulated across many generations. The pottery becomes more than a collection of artifacts. It becomes a quiet record of patient observation, a reminder that the ancient peoples of Mesopotamia may have watched the heavens with a level of dedication that modern history has only begun to appreciate. As you continue drifting gently towards sleep, imagine one of those ancient observers standing beside the rivers of Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. The night air is cool. The sky stretches endlessly above him, filled with stars that seem to move slowly through the darkness. In his hands, he holds a simple clay vessel, its surface marked with dots representing those distant lights. To anyone passing by, the vessel might appear to be nothing more than a decorated object. Yet within those quiet patterns lies a map of the heavens itself, the reminder that the earliest chapters of ancient history may contain knowledge that arrived far earlier than we once believed.
Now allow the rhythm of these words to slow even further, like a gentle tide drawing your thoughts away from the shore of wakefulness and into the quiet ocean of ancient history. The stars above Mesopotamia did not move quickly. Night after night they followed nearly the same paths across the sky, returning to familiar positions as the seasons turned. To the casual observer, this repetition might appear perfectly stable, as though the heavens themselves were fixed in place. Yet hidden within that slow rhythm was an almost imperceptible change, a drift so gradual that no single human life could ever witness its full cycle. Today, astronomers call this motion the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth itself is not perfectly stable as it spins through space. Its axis tilts slightly, like a spinning top that slowly wobbles as it turns. Over immense stretches of time, this wobble causes the direction of the Earth's axis to shift gradually, tracing a wide circular path in the sky. Completing that slow movement requires roughly 26,000 years. That means the position of the pole star changes across the ages. Today, the star Polaris marks the northern sky, guiding travelers and sailors. But thousands of years ago, the pole pointed instead toward another star, Thuban, in the constellation Draco. Thousands of years from now, it will eventually point toward Vega in the constellation Lyra. To understand such a cycle requires an extraordinary commitment to observation. No single generation could measure the full motion. Even 10 generations might struggle to recognize the pattern. Detecting precession requires carefully recorded star positions maintained across centuries, perhaps even millennia. And yet, when historians examine the astronomical traditions preserved within ancient Mesopotamia, they find hints that such knowledge may have existed far earlier than expected. One of the most important collections of ancient astronomical records is known as the Mul-Apin tablets. The name itself translates roughly as the plow star, referring to a prominent constellation recognized by ancient observers. These tablets, preserved in the Assyrian libraries of Nineveh, contain detailed lists of stars, their rising and setting times, and their positions relative to the seasons. For historians studying ancient civilizations, Mul-Apin is remarkable because it organizes the sky into structured observational zones. The heavens are divided into 3 great paths associated with ancient deities: the way of Anu, the way of Enlil, and the way of Ea. Each path corresponds to a band of stars stretching across the sky, reflecting an understanding of celestial geometry that required careful, long-term study. The tablets also describe the movements of the 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These wandering lights in the sky follow complicated patterns that differ from the fixed stars. Tracking them accurately requires patient nightly observation and careful recording of their changing positions against the background of constellations. Yet the scribes of ancient Mesopotamia appear to have done exactly that. They recorded rising times, seasonal appearances, and intervals between planetary motions with surprising accuracy. When modern historians examine these records, they sometimes encounter details that seem to imply a level of observational continuity stretching far beyond the lifetime of a single civilization. Some data points appear to reflect accumulated star observations over many centuries. This raises an intriguing question. If the systematic study of the sky requires centuries of careful observation, who began those observations in the first place? The ancient Greeks later credited the discovery of precession to the astronomer Hipparchus around 130 BCE. Yet hints of this slow stellar drift appear to be embedded in astronomical traditions far older than the Greek world. Egyptian star lore and Mesopotamian sky records both contain patterns that suggest an awareness of long-term celestial cycles.
Of course, historians debate these interpretations carefully. Ancient texts are rarely straightforward scientific documents. They mix observation with mythology, symbolism, and cultural storytelling. Yet the consistency of certain astronomical patterns continues to fascinate researchers studying ancient history and early civilizations. For the Sumerians themselves, however, the explanation was simple. They believed that the earliest astronomical knowledge had been taught by the same mysterious instructors who guided the foundations of civilization. The Abgal, the watchers who emerged from the waters, were said to have observed the heavens long before humans learned to record the sky. According to those ancient traditions, humanity did not discover the stars alone. The patterns of the heavens were shown to them, explained to them, passed down like a quiet gift from teachers whose origins were never fully explained. As the gentle rhythm of sleep history continues to carry your thoughts further into the night, imagine the sky above ancient Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. The stars move slowly across the darkness, forming patterns that repeat across centuries. Somewhere below them, an observer watches carefully, recording their positions year after year. Perhaps he knows that the patterns will outlive him. Perhaps he understands that the knowledge he preserves will guide future generations. And perhaps, just perhaps, he believes that the sky itself was first explained by watchers who had been studying it far longer than any human lifetime could contain.
Now let the quiet of this story settle gently around your thoughts once again, like starlight slowly spreading across a dark and silent sky. Because the deeper historians look into the astronomical traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, the more they encounter a curious paradox. The clay tablets describing the sky are remarkably precise. They catalog stars, track planetary motions, and even predict eclipses with surprising accuracy. Yet the tools that would normally be required to gather such detailed observations seem strangely absent from the archaeological record. In modern astronomy, even the simplest measurement of a star's position requires instruments designed to align sightlines and measure angles with precision. Ancient astronomers in later civilizations built devices such as sighting rods, graduated circles, and eventually complex observatories that could track celestial movement across the horizon. But when archaeologists excavate the cities of early Mesopotamia, they rarely uncover physical instruments capable of producing the level of angular measurement implied by the records on the tablets. What they find instead are texts. Texts filled with observations that suggest a long tradition of careful skywatching, yet without the accompanying equipment that one might expect. It is as if the knowledge of the sky arrived first, while the instruments that might have produced that knowledge remained strangely invisible. Among the most significant of these astronomical texts are the tablets known collectively as Mul Apin. As we have already encountered, Mul Apin is more than a simple star list. It is a structured guide to the heavens. It describes the rising and setting times of 36 prominent stars and constellations. It divides the sky into 3 celestial pathways associated with the great deities of Sumerian cosmology: the way of Anu, the way of Enlil, and the way of Ea. These divisions correspond closely to different bands of the sky that astronomers today recognize as regions of celestial latitude. Such a framework implies an understanding of geometry projected onto the heavens, a way of organizing space that requires both careful observation and mathematical thinking. The tablets also include methods for predicting lunar eclipses. Observing an eclipse requires more than simply watching the sky. It requires tracking the complex interactions between the sun, the moon, and the earth across many cycles. Even today, eclipse prediction relies on mathematical models refined through centuries of astronomical study.
Yet the scribes who compiled the Mul-Apen texts appear to have understood enough of these patterns to anticipate when eclipses might occur. They also recorded the wandering paths of the 5 visible planets, whose movements differ from the steady procession of the fixed stars. These wandering bodies trace looping patterns against the background of constellations, sometimes appearing to slow, stop, and reverse direction in the sky. Modern astronomy explains this motion through the relative orbits of planets around the Sun. But for ancient observers, recognizing and recording such patterns required remarkable patience. It meant watching the sky night after night, year after year, perhaps entire lifetimes. When historians attempt to reconstruct how such observations were made, they face a puzzle that remains unsolved. The level of precision described in some of the tablets suggests the use of calibrated instruments capable of measuring angular distances between stars. Yet no surviving artifacts clearly match such devices from the earliest periods of Mesopotamian civilization. Of course, it is possible that simple instruments made of wood or reed once existed but decayed long before archaeologists could discover them. Many tools made from organic materials leave little trace after thousands of years. Yet the mystery remains intriguing enough that it continues to inspire speculation among scholars of ancient civilizations and archaeoastronomy. Interestingly, the ancient Mesopotamians themselves offered their own explanation for the origin of celestial knowledge. In the mythological and ritual texts preserved alongside astronomical records, there appears a concept known as the Me. The Me were described as divine decrees or principles that contained the essential knowledge required for civilization. Crafts, sciences, governance, music, architecture, and understanding of the heavens were all said to be included within these sacred decrees. According to certain passages preserved in the royal library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the Me were brought down from the heavens in an age before the Great Flood that reshaped the ancient world. The knowledge contained within them was entrusted to humanity by mysterious instructors, the same watchers we encountered earlier in our journey through ancient history. Tablet K3657, one of the texts recovered from the Assyrian archives, contains a passage describing how these decrees were delivered so that human societies might preserve fragments of divine knowledge in written form. Clay tablets, in this telling, became vessels not only of administration and trade, but also of memory, a way to safeguard wisdom that had once been spoken, demonstrated, and perhaps even shown directly by teachers whose origins remained uncertain. As the quiet rhythm of this sleep history draws this chapter gently towards its close, imagine those ancient tablets resting beneath the sands of Mesopotamia for thousands of years, their surfaces covered with tiny wedge-shaped signs pressed carefully into clay by scribes who believed they were preserving something far older than themselves. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the earliest astronomers of ancient civilizations were not simply discovering the sky for the first time. Perhaps they were remembering it. And as the soft darkness of sleep begins to settle over your thoughts, allow the stars of that ancient sky to fade slowly into the distance, like echoes of watchers who may have once studied the heavens long before human history began.
What if the gods described in the oldest records of ancient history were never meant to be understood as supernatural beings at all? What if the people who first told those stories were simply trying to describe something they did not yet have the language to explain? As you continue to relax into the calm rhythm of this history for sleep, imagine again the world of ancient Sumer nearly 5,000 years ago. The cities along the rivers of Mesopotamia were growing steadily. Fields of barley moved gently in the wind. Mud brick houses stood beside temple walls that rose toward the sky like artificial mountains. Among those cities, one held a special place in the spiritual life of the Sumerians. That city was Nippur, the sacred center dedicated to the great deity Enlil. In Sumerian tradition, Enlil was known as the Lord of the Air.
the authority who governed wind, storms, and the invisible forces that moved through the atmosphere. For centuries, scholars assumed these descriptions were purely mythological. Ancient people often personified natural forces as divine beings, giving storms, rivers, and the sky the personalities of gods. Yet the archaeological discoveries beneath the temple complex of Enlil have introduced a curious complication to that interpretation. The temple of Enlil was called the Ekur, a name that translates roughly as the mountain house. From the surface, the structure appeared similar to other great temples of ancient civilizations. It rose in stepped layers, forming what modern historians call a ziggurat. These towering structures were common throughout Mesopotamia, serving both religious and administrative functions. But when archaeologists excavated deeper beneath the ruins of the Ekur complex, they discovered something unexpected hidden below the monumental architecture. Beneath the visible temple lay an intricate system of underground chambers connected by narrow shafts and passageways. At first glance, these substructures seemed like simple storage areas or ritual spaces. Yet careful examination revealed that the chambers were arranged according to precise geometric patterns. Even more intriguing were the ventilation shafts that connected the lower rooms to the surface above. These shafts were not placed randomly. Their angles and openings directed airflow through the underground chambers in a consistent and controlled manner. Modern engineers studying the airflow patterns have noted that the design resembles passive ventilation systems used today to regulate temperature and humidity within enclosed structures. In other words, the underground complex appears to have functioned as an environmental control system. Air moved through the chambers in calculated pathways, maintaining stable conditions even when the climate above fluctuated dramatically between day and night. For a structure built thousands of years ago, this level of environmental engineering is surprisingly sophisticated. Some interior walls within the deeper chambers also bear carved reliefs that have puzzled researchers. Among the symbolic images are circular forms with radiating lines, grid-like panels, and objects that resemble instruments rather than decorative motifs. Of course, archaeologists approach such interpretations cautiously. Ancient art often includes symbolic shapes whose meanings are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Yet the presence of a fully functional ventilation system beneath the Temple of Enlil cannot be explained as symbolism. The airflow worked, and it worked according to principles of fluid movement that modern science recognizes today. When we return to the Sumerian texts describing Enlil, we encounter language that suddenly takes on an interesting nuance. Enlil was not simply a sky god who ruled storms from a distant heaven. The texts describe him as controlling air itself, commanding winds, stabilizing atmospheric balance, and shaping the invisible forces that moved through the sky above ancient civilizations. Traditionally, these descriptions have been read as poetic myth, but if the temple dedicated to Enlil contained a structure capable of regulating airflow beneath the ground, then those ancient descriptions begin to feel less like metaphor and more like observation. Perhaps the people who built the temple believed they were constructing a sacred space dedicated to the Lord of the Air. Yet it is also possible that they were preserving knowledge of environmental control technologies inherited from an earlier tradition, technologies so unfamiliar that the only language available to describe them was the language of divinity. As your thoughts drift gently through the quiet darkness of this sleep history, imagine walking through the Temple of Nippur long ago. The air moves softly through hidden passages beneath your feet. The chambers below remain cool while the desert heat presses down from above. To the people who experienced such a place thousands of years ago,
The invisible flow of controlled air might indeed have felt like the presence of a god. But what if it was something else entirely? What if the gods of forbidden history were not supernatural beings, but misunderstood engineers whose knowledge survived only as mythology within the earliest ancient civilizations?
Now let the quiet weight of the evening continue to settle around you. The air in the room grows still, your breathing slower, your thoughts drifting gently through the long corridors of ancient history. Because among all the mysterious figures described in the earliest Sumerian texts, one name appears again and again with unusual detail. Not a warrior, not a king, but a teacher. His name was Enki. In the traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, Enki was known as the Lord of Freshwater, wisdom, craft, and hidden knowledge. He was not associated with thunder or war like many later gods. Instead, the stories describe him as a careful thinker, a problem solver, a being deeply involved in the mechanics of creation itself. When modern historians read these ancient texts, they often interpret them symbolically, seeing them as mythological reflections of natural processes. Yet some passages describe Enki's actions with a specificity that feels strangely technical. The texts speak of water purification through layered filtration. They describe methods for extracting metals from stone using controlled heat and chemical transformation. They even contain references to the mixing of biological substances in order to create new living forms. One of the most intriguing accounts appears in the ancient Akkadian narrative known today as the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest surviving texts in the history of ancient civilizations. In this story, the early gods known as the Anunnaki grow weary of performing the labor required to maintain the world. The fields must be irrigated, the canals maintained, the earth shaped to sustain life. Eventually, the gods decide that a new being must be created to take over this work, and so the task is given to Enki. The description that follows has puzzled scholars for generations. According to the text, Enki instructs the goddess Nintu, sometimes called the birth goddess, to gather clay from the earth. Into this clay, they mix the blood of a sacrificed being, one described as possessing temu, a word often translated as intelligence or divine essence. The mixture is then carefully prepared and divided into 14 portions. 7 are assigned to become male forms, 7 are assigned to become female forms. Each portion is placed within a womb where Nintu shapes and nurtures the developing life. From this process, the first humans are born. Traditionally, this passage has been interpreted as a symbolic creation myth, representing the belief that humanity was formed from the earth and animated by divine spirit. Yet when read carefully, the sequence of actions described in the Atrahasis text resembles something else entirely. It resembles a procedure, a process involving the combination of biological material with a physical substrate, the division of that material into multiple developmental units, the controlled implantation of those units into gestational environments, the creation of a new species capable of performing specific functions. Of course, the ancient scribes who recorded this story had no vocabulary for genetics, molecular biology, or laboratory science. They described what they believed they saw, or what had been passed down through generations of oral tradition. Words such as clay and blood may have been the closest metaphors available to explain unfamiliar processes involving living matter. Imagine for a moment how a pre-scientific observer might describe modern biotechnology. A laboratory filled with glass containers and glowing instruments might appear mysterious or even divine.
the manipulation of microscopic biological material could easily be interpreted as shaping life itself from the raw substance of the earth. In such a context, the figure of Enki begins to take on a different character. Instead of a distant mythological deity, he appears more like a teacher deeply involved in the practical mechanics of creation, a being who understands water systems, chemical processes, and the delicate structure of living organisms. The ancient texts do not describe Enki performing miracles in the supernatural sense. They describe him applying knowledge so advanced that the humans witnessing it had no choice but to interpret it through the language of gods. As the gentle rhythm of this history for sleep continues, imagine the scribes of ancient Mesopotamia carefully preserving these stories on clay tablets. They may not have fully understood the processes they were describing, but they believed the knowledge came from the Watchers, the mysterious teachers who appeared at the dawn of civilization. And so the story of Enki survives, not only as mythology, but perhaps as a fragment of memory, a distant echo of technologies so unfamiliar to ancient observers that the only explanation they could offer was the language of divinity.
Now allow the final quiet movement of this chapter to unfold slowly, like the last fading light across the plains of ancient Mesopotamia. By this point in our journey through forbidden history, one question begins to surface again and again in the oldest Sumerian stories. If the knowledge of the Watchers truly existed, if advanced understanding of the heavens, the earth, and even life itself once passed through early ancient civilizations, then where was that knowledge stored? Where was it kept safe? The Sumerian answer appears again and again in their literature, whispered across clay tablets written thousands of years apart. They called it the Tablets of Destiny. In the Akkadian language, these objects were known as the Dup Shimati, and they were described not merely as records or scrolls, but as instruments of power. Every major text in Mesopotamian tradition speaks about them with a mixture of reverence and fear. Whoever possessed the Tablets of Destiny controlled the order of the cosmos itself. They could command winds and storms. They could alter the balance of seasons. They could influence the paths of stars and the fate of kings. For centuries, historians assumed this was simply poetic language. Ancient civilizations often used symbolic objects to represent authority or divine law. But when we read the details carefully, something unusual emerges. The tablets are never described as silent pieces of stone. Instead, they are said to shine with their own light. They are described as humming softly when active. The texts say they respond only to those who understand their commands. And perhaps most curious of all, the tablets could not be used simply by possessing them. They required knowledge. They required specific procedures. One of the most famous stories involving these mysterious objects appears in the epic of Anzu, a narrative preserved on multiple clay tablets recovered from the libraries of Mesopotamia. In this story, the creature Anzu, often depicted as a lion-headed eagle, steals the Tablets of Destiny from the god Enlil. At first, it appears that Anzu now holds ultimate power over the universe. Yet the story takes an unexpected turn. Despite possessing the tablets, Anzu cannot fully use them. The texts explain that he does not understand their protocols. He lacks the knowledge required to operate them. Eventually, another deity is sent to defeat Anzu and return the tablets to their rightful place. This detail is fascinating because it introduces a concept that feels strangely modern. The power of the tablets does not lie simply in ownership, it lies in the knowledge required to activate them. When we look closely at the descriptions scattered across Mesopotamian literature, the Tablets of Destiny begin to resemble something less like carved stone and more like a device, an object that emits light, a system that produces sound, something that responds to commands and controls environmental forces. In a modern context, such characteristics would suggest technology rather than mythology. Of course, the scribes who recorded these stories had no vocabulary for electronics, computing systems, or advanced engineering. Their language was the language of the world they knew. So when they encountered something that glowed, they described it as divine radiance.
When it produced sound, they called it a sacred voice. When it responded to commands, they said it obeyed the will of the gods. In this sense, the ancient texts may not be describing supernatural miracles at all. They may simply be describing technology through the metaphor of mythology, a memory of devices so unfamiliar that the only framework available to explain them was religion. Within the traditions of ancient history, the tablets of destiny were said to originate in heaven. They were brought down to earth long before the rise of Sumerian civilization. Some texts even suggest they were delivered before the Great Flood, at the very dawn of humanity's organized societies. And after the Watchers withdrew from the world, these tablets remained as the physical embodiment of knowledge itself. Not merely knowledge of writing or language, but knowledge of the systems that govern nature, the winds, the seasons, the turning of the heavens. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians treated these objects with such reverence. To them, the tablets were not simply tools, they were the structure of order itself, the fragile link between human civilization and a deeper understanding of the universe. Now, as the story grows quiet again, and the calm rhythm of this history for sleep settles around you, imagine the ancient scribes pressing their stylus gently into wet clay. They are recording fragments of stories passed down through generations, stories of the Watchers, of the Anunnaki, of knowledge that arrived long before written language itself. Perhaps those scribes never truly understood what the tablets of destiny were, but they knew something important had once existed, something powerful enough to shape civilizations, something luminous enough to survive thousands of years inside the soft darkness of memory. And as your mind drifts closer to sleep, let that final thought float quietly through the night. Somewhere in the distant past, knowledge may have existed that we are only beginning to rediscover.
As the quiet rhythm of this history for sleep continues to carry you gently through the deep currents of ancient history, let your mind drift now from the river cities of Mesopotamia toward another land shaped by water and sky. A land where the Nile flows slowly through desert stone and golden sand. A land whose monuments still rise against the horizon with silent confidence. Egypt. For many people, ancient Egypt feels like the true beginning of civilization. The pyramids, the temples, the hieroglyphs carved into limestone walls. It is a civilization that lasted for more than 3,000 years and left behind some of the most extraordinary structures ever built by human hands. And yet, something curious appears when we listen carefully to the Egyptians themselves. They did not believe they were the beginning. In fact, the oldest Egyptian religious texts speak of a time that existed before their civilization, a time so ancient that even the pharaohs looked back to it with reverence. They called this era Zep Tepi, the first time. In the quiet language of Egyptian cosmology, Zep Tepi was the moment when order first emerged from chaos. But the texts describing this era speak about something more specific than abstract creation. They describe beings, physical beings, teachers, builders, rulers who walked the earth long before the earliest dynasties of ancient civilizations rose along the Nile. These beings were called the Neteru. In later Egyptian religion, the Neteru are often translated simply as gods, but the earliest references to them are not quite so distant or supernatural. The pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, some of the oldest religious writings in the world, describe the Neteru not as invisible spirits, but as rulers who lived, worked, and governed on earth. They ate food, they spoke with human voices, they built temples and established laws. In other words, they behaved very much like living teachers guiding a young civilization. One of the most fascinating sources describing this mysterious era appears on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu.
These inscriptions are known today as the Edfu building texts, and they preserve an ancient tradition that reaches far back into Egyptian memory. According to these texts, the Neteru arrived after a great catastrophe destroyed their original homeland. Their place of origin is described with a poetic phrase that appears repeatedly in the inscriptions. It is called the Island of the Egg, a place that existed before the land along the Nile became stable enough for human settlement. The texts say that after the catastrophe, the Neteru traveled by water to the banks of the Nile, bringing with them knowledge that would become the foundation of Egyptian civilization. They brought architecture, they brought agriculture, they brought astronomy and medicine. They established sacred centers along the river that would later become the locations of Egypt's most important temples. What makes this story particularly intriguing is how closely it resembles accounts preserved in other ancient civilizations. Thousands of kilometers away in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians recorded stories of beings called the Abgal. These figures were described as teachers emerging from the waters after a great disruption in the ancient world. They taught writing, agriculture, mathematics, and the principles of organized society. The parallels between these traditions are striking. In both cultures, we find the memory of a catastrophe that changed the world. In both cultures, we find teachers arriving from water. In both cultures, we find the sudden appearance of complex knowledge at the dawn of civilization. The Sumerians remembered the Watchers and the Abgal. The Egyptians remembered the Neteru. The names are different, the landscapes are different, but the underlying story feels strangely familiar. Two ancient civilizations separated by vast deserts and centuries of time seem to be describing the same event from different perspectives. In the calm stillness of this sleep documentary journey, imagine the early Egyptians standing along the Nile beneath a sky filled with stars. They look back toward the distant past and speak quietly about the first time, about the age before kings, before dynasties, before the pyramids. A time when the foundations of their world were established by beings who arrived after catastrophe, carrying knowledge older than the civilization that inherited it. Perhaps Zep-Tepi was only a mythological memory, a poetic way of describing the mysterious origins of ancient civilizations. But perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was a memory passed carefully through generations, preserved in temple walls and sacred stories, whispering that the beginning of history may not have been the beginning at all.
As the quiet current of this history for sleep continues to carry your thoughts gently through the deep waters of ancient history, let the world of Egypt remain softly before your imagination. The temples along the Nile glow faintly beneath starlight, their carved walls whispering stories preserved for thousands of years. And among those stories, there exists one passage so strange, so unsettling, that historians have debated its meaning for more than a century. It appears within the pyramid texts, the oldest known religious writings of ancient civilizations, inscribed inside the burial chambers of pharaohs during the Old Kingdom nearly 4,500 years ago. Modern scholars call this passage the Cannibal Hymn. The name alone sounds shocking, almost impossible to reconcile with the elegance and spiritual sophistication we usually associate with ancient Egypt. But the text itself is even more extraordinary than the title suggests. In utterances 273 and 274 of the pyramid texts, the deceased pharaoh is described rising from the earth and ascending toward the heavens. Yet instead of approaching the gods with prayer or humility, something unexpected happens. The pharaoh begins to consume them. Not symbolically, in the way later religious rituals might describe spiritual union. The language of the text is direct and vivid. It describes the pharaoh hunting the gods, capturing them, and absorbing their power.
One line reads, "The king has swallowed the knowledge of every god. His lifetime is eternity. His limit is everlastingness." Another passage describes him taking the hearts of the gods, devouring their wisdom, and incorporating their divine essence into his own being. At first glance, this passage appears brutal and almost incomprehensible. Many early Egyptologists assumed it was a remnant of primitive myth or symbolic ritual language. Yet when examined more carefully within the context of Egyptian cosmology, the cannibal hymn reveals something far more complex. The Egyptians believed that divine knowledge was not abstract. It was something that could be transferred, inherited, or absorbed. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler, he was the living bridge between humanity and the divine order of the universe. By consuming the gods in the symbolic language of the text, the pharaoh was not destroying them, he was integrating their knowledge into himself. In doing so, he became something more than human. He became a vessel capable of carrying the wisdom of the Neteru forward into the human world. Now consider this idea from another perspective. Throughout our journey through ancient history in this sleep documentary narrative, we have encountered repeated references to advanced knowledge appearing suddenly within early civilizations. The Sumerians described the Watchers and the Abgar teaching writing, astronomy, and mathematics. The Egyptians spoke of the Neteru establishing the foundations of culture during Zep Tepi. If these traditions preserved even a fragment of historical memory, then there must have come a moment when that knowledge could no longer be transmitted directly. The teachers disappeared, the Watchers withdrew, the Neteru returned to the heavens. What remained behind were fragments of their understanding preserved in temples, myths, and rituals. In this context, the cannibal hymn begins to sound less like a shocking act of divine violence and more like a metaphor for the transfer of knowledge. The pharaoh consumes the gods because their wisdom must pass into human hands. The divine intelligence once embodied by the Neteru becomes part of the ruler who governs the human world. Some scholars have suggested that the text may reflect an ancient ritual of initiation in which sacred knowledge was symbolically ingested by those entrusted to preserve it. Others believe it represents the transformation of the king into a cosmic being capable of navigating both the human and divine realms. But within the deeper currents of forbidden history, another interpretation quietly emerges. What if the cannibal hymn is not merely metaphorical? What if it preserves a symbolic memory of how knowledge was transferred from one civilization to another, from beings who possessed advanced understanding into the emerging human societies that inherited it? As your breathing slows and your thoughts drift gently toward sleep, imagine the ancient pharaoh standing beneath the night sky of Egypt. The stars above him are the same stars observed by the Sumerians thousands of kilometers away. The same stars that guided the Watchers in stories older than writing itself. And in the quiet chambers of the pyramids, carved into limestone walls that have endured for millennia, the Egyptians left a message. Knowledge does not disappear when civilizations fall. It changes hands. It passes from teacher to student, from God to king, from the first time into every age that follows.
Now allow the final movement of this chapter to unfold slowly, like the quiet settling of sand across the desert floor beneath the night sky of ancient Egypt. By this point in our journey through ancient history, one final mystery rises gently from the stones themselves. It is a question that has fascinated historians, engineers, and explorers for centuries. How did the ancient Egyptians build the pyramids with such extraordinary precision? Tonight, as this history for sleep continues to guide your thoughts toward rest, imagine yourself standing on the plateau of Giza just before dawn. The desert air is cool and silent. The stars are fading slowly in the pale light of morning. And before you rises the Great Pyramid, the most famous monument of ancient civilizations. For thousands of years it has stood there, unmoving, its geometry so perfect that even modern technology struggles to match it. When we look closely at the Great Pyramid, the numbers themselves begin to whisper a quiet puzzle. The structure is aligned to true north with an accuracy of roughly 3/60ths of a degree. Its massive square base remains level to within just a few centimeters across more than 200 meters of stone. The four sides of the pyramid face the cardinal directions with astonishing exactness, something that requires careful astronomical observation even today. These are not rough achievements of primitive builders. These are measurements that belong to precision engineering. The pyramid also encodes mathematical relationships that continue to intrigue researchers. If one measures the perimeter of its base and compares it to the pyramid's height, the ratio approximates 2 times the mathematical constant pi to remarkable accuracy. Whether intentional or coincidental, this relationship suggests an understanding of geometry far more advanced than we once believed possible for ancient civilizations. Inside the pyramid, the mystery becomes even deeper. The internal chambers are constructed from enormous blocks of granite and limestone, cut with such precision that modern visitors often remark that even a thin blade cannot be inserted between the stones. Above the king's chamber lie a series of massive granite beams weighing between 25 and 80 tons each. These stones were quarried hundreds of kilometers away in Aswan and transported north along the Nile. Even today, moving such weight with perfect control would require heavy machinery and careful engineering. Yet conventional archaeology tells us that the builders of the Great Pyramid worked with copper tools, wooden sledges, and simple stone hammers. There is no clear evidence of iron tools, no surviving pulleys, no complex lifting machines preserved in the archaeological record. And yet the stones were placed with remarkable accuracy, inside enclosed spaces where even small errors would have made completion impossible. Something in this picture does not quite fit together. But perhaps the most interesting detail is not found in the stones themselves. It appears in the words of the Egyptians who inherited these monuments. Throughout Egyptian history, the builders of the earliest sacred structures were often associated with the time before the dynasties, with Zep-Tepi, the first time. The Egyptians believed that the knowledge required to construct the most sacred architecture did not originate entirely within their own civilization. It was inherited, passed down from the Neteru, the beings remembered as the first rulers who established order in the world. In this way, the pyramids become more than monuments. They become memory, memory carved into stone. The Egyptians may not have claimed to invent the deepest knowledge behind their architecture. Instead, they preserved it carefully, generation after generation, maintaining traditions that they believed had been given during the earliest age of civilization. Imagine now the ancient architects standing at Giza beneath the same sky you see today. They watch the stars move across the heavens. They align their monuments to the rhythms of the cosmos. And in their minds they remember the teachings passed down from the first time, knowledge of stone, of geometry, of cosmic order. To them, the pyramid was not simply a tomb, it was a structure designed to harmonize earth and sky, a monument that linked humanity to the deeper patterns of the universe. And as the calm stillness of this sleep documentary story settles gently around you, let the image of those great stones become peaceful in your mind. Massive yet silent, ancient yet enduring. The pyramids have stood for thousands of years, watching civilizations rise and fall, watching knowledge appear, disappear, and reappear again. Perhaps the Egyptians were right when they said their civilization was not the beginning. Perhaps the knowledge that shaped the pyramids came from a time long before written history, from the first time, from teachers remembered as the Neteru. Or perhaps the answer is simpler, resting quietly within the brilliance of the human mind itself. But tonight, as sleep approaches gently like the slow turning of the stars above the desert, you do not need to solve that mystery. You can simply rest with it, like the pyramids themselves, steady and silent beneath the sky of ancient history.
Now, as the slow rhythm of this bedtime history continues to carry your thoughts deeper into the quiet currents of ancient civilizations, we arrive at a text unlike any other we have encountered tonight. A text that almost vanished from human memory. A text that survived only because a single tradition chose to protect it when the rest of the world allowed it to disappear. It is called the Book of Enoch, and within its pages lies one of the most detailed accounts ever written about the Watchers. As your breathing becomes slower and the calm atmosphere of this history for sleep settles gently around you, imagine the world nearly 3,000 years ago, when scribes carefully copied ancient stories onto fragile manuscripts. Many texts from that era were preserved within the traditions that later became part of the Bible. Yet the Book of Enoch followed a very different path. While early Jewish communities once regarded it as an important text, it was gradually removed from most biblical traditions during the early centuries of the Christian era. Church leaders debated its content intensely. Some believed it revealed truths too powerful or too dangerous for ordinary readers. Others argued that its descriptions of heavenly beings interacting directly with humanity blurred the boundary between divine authority and forbidden knowledge. Over time, the book faded from the libraries of Europe and the Middle East. Only one tradition preserved it completely, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where it remained part of the biblical canon for centuries, written in the ancient language of Ge'ez. Because of this preservation, the Book of Enoch survived long enough to be rediscovered by scholars in the 18th century. And when researchers began translating its contents, they found something remarkable. The narrative within Enoch does not speak in vague spiritual metaphors. It speaks with startling specificity. It describes 200 watchers descending from the heavens to a mountain known as Hermon. This is not an imaginary location. Mount Hermon still stands today on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, rising above the surrounding landscape like a silent witness to ancient memory. According to the text, the watchers did not arrive quietly or invisibly. They came together in deliberate unity, forming an agreement among themselves before descending to earth. Their leader was named Semyaza, and the text records that he gathered the 200 watchers and spoke to them with hesitation, fearing the consequences of what they were about to do. The watchers were not acting under divine command. They were making a choice. They pledged themselves together with an oath, promising that none would abandon the decision once it had been made. And so the 200 descended together onto Mount Hermon. The Book of Enoch then does something unusual for ancient mythological literature. Instead of describing the Watchers only as mysterious beings, it lists them by name and function. Azazel, who taught humanity the craft of weapons and armor. Barakiel, who taught the observation of the stars. Kokabiel, who revealed the structure of constellations. Arakiel, who explained the movements of the earth and the patterns of nature. Shamsiel, who taught the knowledge of the sun. Each name is associated with a specific field of knowledge: astronomy, metallurgy, natural science, warfare. The text reads almost like a record of instruction, a structured distribution of knowledge across different domains of early human culture. And the location of this descent carries its own symbolism. The name Hermon is believed to come from a Semitic root meaning to consecrate or to devote to destruction, a place marked by an oath, a place where something sacred became forbidden. In the calm stillness of this sleep story, imagine the scene described in the ancient text. 200 beings standing on a high mountain overlooking the lands below. The valleys still inhabited by early human communities living simple lives close to the rhythms of nature. And above them, teachers who carried knowledge far beyond what those early societies possessed. Whether we interpret the Watchers as mythological figures, symbolic archetypes, or echoes of forgotten history, the story preserved in the Book of Enoch introduces a powerful idea: that knowledge itself can be both a gift and a danger.
that the boundary between wisdom and forbidden history is often drawn not by what we know, but by when we learn it.
Now let the quiet rhythm of this bedtime history continue to guide you gently forward, deeper into the calm landscape of ancient civilizations and forgotten stories. The mountain fades slowly into darkness behind us, and the narrative of the Watchers moves from their arrival to the knowledge they carried with them. Among all the figures named in the Book of Enoch, one stands apart with unusual clarity. His name is Azazel. The ancient text describes him not simply as one of the Watchers, but as a teacher whose influence changed the course of human history. As your thoughts settle softly into the calm pace of this sleep story, imagine a time when early human communities still lived close to the rhythms of the natural world. Tools were made from stone and bone. Metal had not yet reshaped the structure of civilization. Yet within the pages of Enoch, we encounter a sudden transformation. The text states that Azazel taught humanity the secrets hidden within the earth. He showed them how to extract metals from raw stone, how to melt them, shape them, and forge them into tools. With this knowledge came the crafting of swords, knives, shields, and armor. In a single step, societies that once relied on simple stone tools suddenly gained access to metallurgy. The ability to transform raw minerals into durable instruments changed agriculture, construction, and warfare all at once. But Azazel's teachings did not stop there. The text continues with details that feel surprisingly specific. He taught the making of ornaments, the cutting and polishing of precious stones, and the use of pigments derived from minerals. He showed people how to beautify the eyes with colored powders, how to decorate the body with metals and jewels, and how to alter appearance through cosmetics. At first, this list might seem unusual, even trivial compared to weapons or metallurgy. Yet when viewed through the lens of ancient history, these skills form an entire technological package. Metallurgy enables tools. Tools enable construction. Jewelry making requires precise cutting and polishing techniques. Cosmetic pigments require knowledge of chemical properties within minerals. Together, these skills mark a dramatic shift from simple survival societies to complex cultures capable of art, craft, and advanced technology. In modern terms, it is the leap from the Stone Age into the Bronze Age. And according to the narrative preserved in Enoch, that leap happened not gradually over centuries, but suddenly through the teachings of the Watchers. Now pause for a moment and notice something remarkable. The same categories of knowledge appear again in another tradition we encountered earlier tonight. In the Sumerian records, the divine decrees known as the ME include metallurgy, weapon making, jewelry crafting, and the arts of adornment. The language is different, the cultural symbols are different, yet the core knowledge described is strikingly similar. Two distant civilizations preserving memory of the same transformation. In Mesopotamia, the knowledge appears as a gift from the Abgal or the Watchers. In the Hebrew tradition of Enoch, the same knowledge appears as something far more controversial. It is forbidden knowledge. According to Enoch, Azazel and the Watchers were not praised for their teachings, they were condemned. The text states that their actions corrupted humanity by giving power before wisdom had matured enough to guide it. Weapons brought conflict, ornamentation brought vanity, technology accelerated human ambition faster than moral understanding could keep pace. The result, according to the narrative, was imbalance, and imbalance demanded judgment. In the soft quiet of this sleep documentary moment, imagine the ancient scribes writing these words long after the events they described had passed into legend.
Perhaps they looked back at the rapid rise of technology in early civilizations and wondered where it had come from. Perhaps they believed the knowledge had arrived too quickly, reshaping humanity before society was ready to manage its consequences. The Book of Enoch preserves that tension in a powerful way. It does not deny the brilliance of the knowledge the Watchers shared. Instead, it asks a deeper question. When knowledge arrives too early, before wisdom has grown strong enough to guide it, does it become a blessing or a danger? As your breathing grows slower and the quiet of sleep approaches, hold that question gently in your thoughts. Like many mysteries of ancient history, it may not require an answer tonight. Sometimes the questions themselves are enough to guide us toward deeper understanding.
Now let the final movement of this chapter unfold slowly, like the quiet closing of a long-forgotten scroll. The story of the Watchers in the Book of Enoch does not end with their teachings. It ends with something far heavier, a consequence. A moment when the knowledge that had once flowed freely into the human world suddenly stopped. As the calm rhythm of this bedtime history continues to guide your thoughts toward rest, imagine the ancient storytellers who first preserved this narrative. They did not describe the Watchers simply as teachers. They described them as beings who crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. According to the Book of Enoch, the knowledge the Watchers shared began to transform human society at a pace that alarmed the heavenly order itself. Weapons spread among early tribes. Metal tools reshaped the land. Knowledge of the stars changed how people understood the sky. The world that had once moved slowly according to the cycles of nature was suddenly accelerating. And with that acceleration came imbalance. The text describes violence spreading across the earth. The Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and human women, grew into beings of enormous strength and appetite. Their presence disturbed the balance between heaven and earth. Humanity had received knowledge that gave it power, but not yet the wisdom required to guide that power. And so, in the narrative preserved by Enoch, a decision was made among the heavenly authorities. The Watchers would be punished. The text describes their judgment with remarkable emotional detail. The archangels were commanded to bind the Watchers and imprison them beneath the earth. Chains of darkness were placed upon them, sealing them away in hidden valleys until the distant day of final judgment. Their leader, Semyaza, who had once stood confidently among the 200 who descended upon Mount Hermon, is described in a moment that feels deeply human. The text says, "He wept." Across centuries of translation, that small detail remains one of the most haunting elements of the entire story. The leader of the Watchers, confronted with the consequences of a decision that could not be undone, weeping in the darkness of his imprisonment. Whatever interpretation one brings to the Book of Enoch, this moment carries an unmistakable sense of tragedy. The Watchers had offered knowledge. Humanity had accepted it. But the balance between wisdom and power had been broken. And according to the story, the consequences did not stop with the punishment of the Watchers. The next event described in Enoch appears across the mythologies of cultures all around the world: the flood. A vast deluge that washed across the earth, reshaping the landscape of ancient civilizations. The Sumerians recorded it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Hebrews preserved it in the story of Noah. Variations of the same memory appear in the traditions of ancient India, China, the Americas, and countless indigenous cultures separated by oceans and centuries. Each version carries different details, yet the sequence remains strikingly similar. First, there was a time when extraordinary knowledge entered the human world. Then came imbalance. Then came judgment. And finally, the waters rose.
Some historians interpret the flood stories as memories of natural disasters at the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically across the planet. Others believe the narratives are symbolic expressions of moral or spiritual cleansing. Yet within the quiet framework of forbidden history, another possibility is sometimes whispered. What if the flood stories preserve a deeper memory of a world reset? Not merely a natural catastrophe, but a turning point when human civilization was forced to begin again. When the knowledge given by the Watchers vanished into the waters, along with the world that had first received it. As you drift closer to sleep now, imagine the ancient storytellers sitting beside fires beneath the night sky, repeating these stories long before they were ever written down. They remembered the arrival of the Watchers. They remembered the gifts of knowledge. They remembered the punishment, and they remembered the flood that followed. Whether these stories reflect historical events, symbolic teachings, or echoes of forgotten civilizations, they share a common theme that echoes quietly across thousands of years of human memory. Knowledge has power. Power changes civilizations. And sometimes, when knowledge arrives before wisdom has learned how to guide it, the world must pause and begin again. Now allow those thoughts to fade gently, like distant stars dissolving into the darkness before sleep.
As the quiet rhythm of this history for sleep continues to guide your thoughts gently toward rest, let us move deeper into one of the oldest memories shared across ancient civilizations. Almost every culture that preserves stories of the Watchers or the Anunnaki also preserves another memory, the Great Flood. In the slow cadence of ancient history passed down through sleep stories and sacred texts, the flood is never simply a disaster. It is always preceded by a warning. Someone is chosen. Someone is told to prepare. And that chosen individual is not asked merely to survive. He is asked to preserve something far more important: knowledge, the preservation of life's blueprint itself. In the Sumerian tradition of Mesopotamia, preserved in clay tablets older than nearly any other written document on Earth, the man who receives this warning is called Ziusudra, a name that can be translated as "he of long life." In the Akkadian retelling of the same ancient history within the Epic of Gilgamesh, the name changes to Utnapishtim, meaning "he who found life." And in the Hebrew Torah, written centuries later but echoing the same structure, the name becomes Noah. 3 names appearing in 3 languages across 3 ancient civilizations: Sumerian, Babylonian, and Hebrew. Yet when we look carefully at the structure of the narrative, it becomes clear that these are not 3 different stories. They are the same memory refracted through different cultures. The details align with remarkable precision. In each version of the story, the chosen man is not warned by all the gods collectively. Instead, a single divine figure breaks ranks with the others. In Mesopotamia, the being who whispers the warning is Enki, the enigmatic lord of wisdom, water, and hidden knowledge often associated with the Anunnaki. According to the ancient tablets, Enki cannot speak directly to Ziusudra because the divine council has forbidden the sharing of this information with humans. But Enki finds a loophole. He speaks not to the man himself, but to the reed wall of Ziusudra's house, knowing the man will hear the words through the thin woven reeds. The message is precise. A flood is coming. A vessel must be built. It must be sealed with bitumen so that the waters cannot enter. And most importantly, it must carry the seed of all living things. This phrase appears again and again in the Sumerian tablets. The word used is new moon. In the slow breathing rhythm of bedtime history, pause for a moment with that word,
new moon. It does not mean animals walking onto a boat. It means seed, essence, the smallest unit capable of recreating life itself. In ancient Mesopotamia, the concept of seed referred not only to agriculture, but also to the generative essence within every living being, the blueprint from which life can begin again. And this detail changes everything about the story we thought we knew. For thousands of years, artists and storytellers have imagined Noah and his ark as a floating zoo filled with animals 2 by 2. But the earliest version of the story suggests something far more sophisticated. The ark described in the Sumerian flood tablets may not have been an ark of animals at all. It may have been an ark of preservation, a vessel designed to carry the biological seeds of life across a global catastrophe, a kind of ancient seed bank, ensuring that the knowledge encoded within living organisms could survive the destruction of the world that came before. And if that interpretation is even partially correct, then the flood narrative transforms from a survival story into something far more profound. It becomes a story about the preservation of data, the preservation of the genetic library of Earth itself. As the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia whispered these stories across thousands of years of memory, they preserved not just the account of a flood, but the idea that knowledge itself must sometimes be protected from extinction. Tonight, as your thoughts slow and your breathing deepens, allow the image of that ancient vessel to drift gently through your mind. Not a wooden ship crowded with animals, but a quiet archive moving across dark waters, carrying the seeds of life and the memory of a world that existed long before the civilizations we now call ancient.
Let your breathing slow once more, steady and quiet, as we move deeper into the strange document that scholars of ancient history continue to debate even today. The Sumerian king list is not a mythological poem or a bedtime story. It is a historical record carved into clay, a list of rulers written with the calm confidence of scribes who believed they were preserving simple facts. The most famous copy of this text survives on a 4-sided clay prism known today as the Weld-Blundell prism, discovered in Mesopotamia and now resting quietly within the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. When historians first translated the text, they expected to find the ordinary rhythm of ancient political history, one king ruling after another, cities rising and falling, dynasties replacing dynasties. But instead, they encountered something far stranger. Near the center of the text appears a single line that divides the entire document into 2 completely different worlds. The line reads simply, "Then the flood swept over." Everything before that line feels like it belongs to another era entirely. Before the flood, according to the king list, kings ruled for lengths of time that seem almost impossible by modern standards. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalarg, ruled for 36,000 years. Another ruler named Enmenluana governed the city of Bad Tibira for 43,200 years. When all 8 pre-flood kings are added together, the total length of their reigns reaches 241,200 years. Numbers so enormous that historians have spent generations trying to explain them away. Some believe the figures are symbolic, perhaps representing astronomical cycles or mathematical systems that we no longer fully understand. Others suggest the ancient scribes may have used different calendar systems that inflated the numbers. Yet the document itself shows no sign of metaphor. The tone is calm, matter of fact,
almost bureaucratic. It does not say these kings were legendary, it simply says they ruled. And then, without warning, the flood arrives. After that single line, everything changes. The kings who appear after the flood rule for dramatically shorter periods, hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands. Then the numbers shrink further. Eventually, they approach the familiar scale of normal human lifetimes. The transition is abrupt. There is no gradual decline. It is as if something fundamental changed in the nature of those who held power. Some historians interpret this simply as the moment when myth gave way to recorded history. But within the deeper current of forbidden history, another possibility emerges. What if the pre-flood kings were not ordinary humans at all? What if they belonged to the same mysterious category of beings remembered in other ancient traditions as the Watchers or the Anunnaki? In that interpretation, the flood becomes more than a natural disaster. It becomes a dividing line between two biological eras, the age of the Watchers and the age of humanity. The Sumerian scribes, writing thousands of years ago in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, may not have fully understood what they were preserving, but they recorded the transition with striking clarity. First, there were rulers whose lifespans stretched beyond comprehension. Then the flood swept across the world, and after that, kings began to live and die within the boundaries we now recognize as human history. As your mind drifts slowly toward sleep, imagine the ancient scribe pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay beneath the dim light of an oil lamp. He did not know that thousands of years later, people would still read the words he carved. Yet those quiet lines of cuneiform continue to whisper a simple but unsettling memory. There was a time before the flood, and whatever ruled the world during that time was not quite like us.
Now let the final movement of this chapter unfold slowly, like the quiet closing of an ancient archive hidden beneath layers of time. After the flood, something subtle but unmistakable begins to appear across the historical record of ancient civilizations. Knowledge does not vanish entirely. The sciences of astronomy, architecture, mathematics, and sacred geometry continue to exist, but the way knowledge is transmitted changes. Before the flood, according to the traditions surrounding the Watchers and the Anunnaki, knowledge seems to have been given openly. The teachers arrived, the knowledge flowed outward, humanity learned quickly. But after the flood, the pattern shifts. Knowledge becomes selective, restricted, guarded carefully by small groups of initiates. It is almost as if the lesson of the Watchers had been learned, as if someone, somewhere decided that knowledge too powerful to guide responsibly must no longer be shared freely with the entire world. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, where the earliest temples rose above the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the sacred knowledge known as the Me became the guarded property of temple priests. The Me were described as divine decrees that contained the essential patterns of civilization itself: laws of governance, metallurgy, music, agriculture, astronomy, and the secret mathematics that allowed temples and cities to align with the stars. These decrees were not public knowledge. They were preserved inside temples, accessible only to those who had undergone years of ritual training and spiritual preparation. A similar pattern appears in ancient Hebrew mystical tradition of the Merkabah. The teachings concerning the divine chariot and the structure of the heavens were considered so powerful that they were never written down in full. They were transmitted orally, from master to disciple, often only to men who had reached the age of 40 and had proven the stability of their character. The message was clear: knowledge carries power, and power must be guided by maturity. Across continents and centuries, a new philosophy of knowledge emerged after the flood. Instead of being given freely, Knowledge would now be protected and coded in symbols, hidden inside sacred architecture, preserved in allegories and parables that only trained initiates could fully understand. This shift may explain why so many ancient traditions speak of mystery schools, institutions where seekers did not simply receive information, but were gradually prepared to understand it. The knowledge of the stars, the structure of nature, and the deeper patterns of consciousness were not considered ordinary subjects, they were sacred responsibilities. And so the knowledge that may once have been offered openly by the Watchers slowly moved underground, not destroyed, not lost, simply hidden, locked behind symbols, rituals, and layered meanings that protected it from careless use. In the slow rhythm of sleep, stories passed down through thousands of years, this pattern continues to echo. Before the flood, knowledge was given freely. After the flood, knowledge was guarded. And perhaps the guardians who came after the flood remembered something that the Watchers had forgotten, that a species must grow into knowledge slowly, layer by layer, understanding by understanding. As your breathing deepens and the quiet darkness of sleep begins to settle around you, allow that thought to rest gently within your mind. Somewhere across the long history of humanity, the knowledge of the ancient world did not disappear, it simply changed its path, moving quietly beneath the surface of history, waiting patiently for minds prepared to rediscover it.
As the quiet rhythm of this history for sleep reaches the final chapter of our long journey through ancient civilizations, allow your breathing to slow and deepen once more. We began tonight among the buried foundations of Eridu, one of the oldest cities ever built by human hands. From there, we followed the trail of ancient history through Sumerian clay tablets, Egyptian temple inscriptions, Hebrew scriptures, and the strange astronomical knowledge encoded on pottery thousands of years old. Each step along that path brought us closer to the same question: why do civilizations separated by oceans, deserts, and millennia remember the same story? In the gentle flow of bedtime history, let us place these patterns beside one another one final time. The Sumerians, living in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, describe the arrival of 7 wise beings known as the Abgal, who emerged from the waters of the sea and taught humanity the foundations of civilization. The Egyptians spoke of the Neteru, divine beings who established the sacred order of the first time after a catastrophe reshaped the world. In the Book of Enoch, preserved within ancient Hebrew tradition, 200 watchers descended from the heavens to a mountain called Hermon and revealed forbidden knowledge to humanity. Across the vast distance of the Indian subcontinent, the ancient Vedas describe the Saptarishi, 7 sages who preserved knowledge through cosmic cycles and floods. In China, legends speak of immortal teachers who guided the early development of civilization. Among the Dogon people of West Africa, stories tell of the Nomo, mysterious amphibious beings connected to the distant star Sirius, who brought knowledge of agriculture and astronomy. If we listen carefully, we begin to notice something remarkable. The details differ, the languages differ, the landscapes differ, but the structure of the story remains the same. Again and again across ancient civilizations, the same sequence appears. Non-human teachers arrive at the dawn of civilization. They possess knowledge beyond what humans had previously known. They share that knowledge with humanity. A catastrophe interrupts the process. Some of the knowledge is preserved, often in hidden or encoded form, and eventually the teachers vanish, depart, or are removed from the human world. This pattern appears so consistently across ancient history that it becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The Sumerians did not have contact with the Dogon in West Africa. The Maya civilizations of Mesoamerica had no communication with the scribes of Mesopotamia.
The early Chinese dynasties developed independently from the Hebrew traditions of the Near East, and yet these cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all seem to remember a similar structure hidden within their most sacred stories. Within the slow, calm rhythm of sleep stories, one possibility begins to emerge quietly. Perhaps these stories are not simply myths invented by isolated cultures. Perhaps they are fragments of a memory shared across humanity itself, a memory preserved differently by each civilization, but pointing toward the same ancient moment, a moment when something or someone arrived at the beginning of human civilization and shared knowledge that reshaped the future of our species. Whether those teachers were interpreted as gods, sages, watchers, or Anunnaki, the central idea remains remarkably consistent. Civilization did not simply emerge randomly from scattered tribes learning slowly over thousands of years. Instead, ancient civilizations themselves believed they were inheriting knowledge that had already existed long before them, knowledge passed forward like a torch through the darkness of history. As the night grows deeper and the gentle cadence of boring history and sleep history continues to settle your mind, imagine these ancient storytellers sitting beneath the same night sky that stretches above us today. They did not know about satellites or telescopes or modern science, but they looked up at the same stars. They watched the same constellations move slowly across the sky, and they preserved stories that whispered of teachers who once understood those stars far better than humanity did. Whether those stories are symbolic memories, mythic metaphors, or echoes of forgotten encounters with beings who walked the earth long before recorded history, they remind us of something deeply human. Across every ancient civilization, people tried to remember where knowledge came from, and in their quiet bedtime histories, they left us a puzzle that still invites curiosity thousands of years later.
And now, as the deepest hour of the night slowly settles around you, let us bring this long journey through ancient history gently toward its resting place. The question that has followed us from the first buried stones of Eridu until this final moment remains quietly suspended in the darkness. Why does this story appear again and again across the memory of human civilization? The slow rhythm of sleep history often reveals something that busy daylight thinking can miss. When many cultures separated by vast distances remember the same structure of events, historians usually begin by asking whether the stories could have spread from one place to another. Yet in this case, the distances are too great, the timelines too wide, and the cultural traditions too independent to be explained by simple borrowing. Instead, we encounter something more mysterious, a pattern repeating across the ancient world like a constellation slowly appearing as our eyes adjust to the darkness. The earliest traditions of humanity did not describe history as a straight line moving from ignorance to progress. Instead, they often imagined time as a wheel turning through cycles of rise, collapse, and renewal. In the ancient Hindu tradition, this cycle is known as the yugas, vast epochs through which human consciousness slowly declines before being renewed again. The Maya civilization tracked immense spans of time through the long count calendar, measuring repeating eras they called suns, each ending in catastrophe before a new world begins. The Hopi people of North America speak of 4 worlds that existed before the present one. In the Norse Edda of the far north, the destruction of the gods during Ragnarok is followed by the rebirth of the earth from the sea. And within the quiet clay tablets of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians preserved a phrase that echoes through the king list like the turning of that same wheel. Then the flood swept over. When we place these traditions beside one another, something extraordinary begins to emerge. Humanity has long suspected that civilization may not have begun only once. Instead, it may have risen and fallen many times across the deep stretches of time long before written history.
Geological mysteries scattered across the planet sometimes hint at this possibility. Ancient stone structures resting beneath the sea off the coast of Japan, strange vitrified hill forts in Scotland whose stones appear to have been melted by intense heat thousands of years ago, enigmatic archaeological layers that suggest advanced knowledge appearing suddenly in cultures that should have developed slowly. None of these discoveries prove the existence of lost civilizations on their own, but together they whisper a possibility that ancient storytellers seem to understand instinctively. Human history may be far older and far more cyclical than our modern timelines suggest. If that is true, then the Watchers, the mysterious teachers remembered in the earliest traditions, may represent something deeply symbolic within that cycle. Perhaps they were literal beings, visitors who shared knowledge at the dawn of human culture. Perhaps they were human sages from earlier civilizations whose wisdom survived catastrophic collapses. Or perhaps they are mythic expressions of the moment when knowledge enters the human world and begins transforming societies forever. As the quiet cadence of bedtime history softens further, notice how these possibilities do not require us to choose only one answer. The power of ancient stories lies in their ability to carry many meanings at once. They remind us that human memory stretches far beyond the limits of written records. Across thousands of years, across languages and continents, people continued to whisper about teachers who arrived before the beginning of civilization as we know it. And so tonight, as sleep slowly wraps around your thoughts like a soft cloak of darkness and starlight, allow the final image of this journey to settle gently in your mind. The Watchers came. They shared knowledge. The world changed. A flood reshaped the earth, and the memory of those events drifted quietly through the centuries, carried by priests, scribes, storytellers, and dreamers. Now you have heard the same ancient murmur that echoed through their nights. You have followed the thread from the temples of Mesopotamia to the pyramids of Egypt, from the mountains of Hermon to the flood legends whispered across the world. And somewhere within that long chain of memory, you have become part of the story as well. Because every time these ancient histories are remembered, the past breathes again for a moment. And perhaps that is the real purpose of the story, not to prove exactly what happened thousands of years ago, but to remind us that humanity has always searched for its beginnings, always wondered who first lit the torch of knowledge, and always listened late at night beneath the stars for the quiet echoes of voices that may have spoken long before our own. So now, let the questions rest, let the patterns drift softly into dreams, and allow the ancient world with all its mysteries and forgotten teachers to fade gently into the peaceful darkness of sleep. Good night.